At Carafem, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. Some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form and, if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, Carafem will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carafem.org.
Get your mother-loving ears on because your big-time radio DJ's got news. PayPal lets you choose how you want to pay for all the stuff. With PayPal, I can pay in-store, pay online, or pay over time. What's that? You want this translated into song? I hope you're sitting down. You can pay your own way. You keep those ears on, you hear? Don't just pay, baby. PayPal.
Learn more at paypal.com.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
Women were just ignored. I mean, there was a kind of discriminatory policy there. The women, in many ways, a lot of them said to me, look, what we want justice. And what they mean by justice, they want answers. I mean, it's not that they want to see somebody sort of get put away for life. But I want to know who actually was involved in killing my. Like, for instance, there were judges killed in Northern Ireland. And there are Catholic judges, the IRA was involved. People haven't been brought to the justice, nobody. And you had so many agents, you had so many informants working within these organizations for different elements of the intelligence community. You would think that, well, should have brought some of them, right? And we should have put some of them away for these crimes. It didn't happen. So people now know, they know that there was a dirty war that went on. They weren't really aware of it at the time. You know, we don't grasp the enormity of it and how this cascades in over the years into sort of feelings of distress, of hurt. You know, it goes on and on. While you know things change politically, these women are still living with the same kind of horror.
Hello. On the afternoon of the 6th of March 1988, in Gibraltar, on the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, Mairead Farrell and 2 other Provisional IRA volunteers were shot dead by members of the Special Air Service. The 3 were on an operation to target one of the last outposts of the British Empire, but their movements were known to the security services. Farrell was one of a small number of female IRA members in an organisation dominated by men. How were mothers, wives, daughters and sisters impacted by the violence over 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland? And how do they deal with the trauma 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement? Joining today is the acclaimed journalist and writer Martin Dillon, author of The Dirty War, The Shankill Butchers and Stone Cold, as well as his most recent, The Sorrow and the Loss, the tragic shadow cast by the Troubles on the lives of women. Coming up, Al Murray joins to discuss the surrenders throughout 1945, and we talk the history of Test cricket. Please do subscribe or follow, and if you can rate or review, I'd be grateful. But until then, it's me talking with Martin Dillon on Women of the Troubles. Martin, great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining. It's a real pleasure to speak to you.
No, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
We're here to talk about your latest book, The Sorrow and the Loss, which is a really account of the Troubles, but coming at it from an angle that's really interesting and actually quite unusual, which is the female side. It seems to be such a male-dominated conflict, the Troubles, although obviously women suffering throughout. But I guess you've accumulated so many stories over the years that this, certainly from women, that this is, I guess, been bursting to come out?
Well, you make a point, I think, which is very interesting. And the troubles have been sort of, in terms of the written record, the written narrative, have been dominated by men, right? Men within organizations, whether it was military, the police, whether it was paramilitaries. But women were generally ignored. It was almost a kind of, by the media, by writers probably like me too, is almost a sort of a de facto, rule that, women were not necessarily to be included, to be, to be reflected in terms of their role or what they were sort of suffering or going through during the whole conflict. Women were just ignored. I mean, there was a kind of discriminatory policy there. Also de facto one. I mean, it took me a long time because when I look back, I mean, I started books like The Dirty War, Stone Cold, The Shankill Butchers, Killer in Clowntown, and even The Enemy Within, all about all these organizations and the men in them, and they sort of formidable and scary figures. And yet with women, I had I'd never shifted the focus and asked the question, well, what about the women? What about the mothers whose sons were being killed, or kids they couldn't get off the streets because they were involved in rioting and then were dragged into paramilitary organizations? Because a lot of the mothers had to deal with this. And it was very difficult to keep your kids indoors when all the other kids were out there throwing petrol bombs and throwing stones at military patrols or, armored personnel carriers. And there was a sort of pent-up anger, and these areas where a lot of this was happening were almost a world apart. They were a world that very few people understood unless you actually lived in them. And as a journalist, I remember I almost lived in some of those areas, was in them so often, and they were very strange. The people had their own lives, their own music. They had their own clubs, illegal drinking clubs, that they called shebeens, where they went in and they listened to all of this sort of revolutionary music, as it were, right? And songs like Take It Down from the Masked Irish Traitors, which was critical of the Irish for ever doing a deal, right, at the beginning of the 20th century. So, you had all of this going on, and a lot of drink being taken, and a lot of the mothers, there were a lot of women too in these clubs every evening. And also a lot of mothers were being fed medications of various kinds. I mean, doctors probably prescribed more pills to women in Northern Ireland in that period than for most of that century. I mean, it really was crazy because it was the only way they could deal with it. The women, they were on drugs a lot. And I remember talking to a psychiatrist about this, and he said, well, how were they going to sort of cope? There were no coping mechanisms like today. In other words, I mean, if it was a shooting in an American school, the first thing that happens is it's flooded with what they call, they're really psychologists, but they flood it with people who are going to listen to kids, talk to them, hear their stories, and try and reassure them that things are going to be fine. There was nothing like that. It just didn't happen. Nobody talked to anybody. Nobody said anything. It was going on, and it was as if they had no control over it. In fact, women didn't have very much control, even women who were within, let's say, the paramilitary structure. And of course, as you know, the paramilitary structure in terms of women only existed really within the IRA, because the IRA historically had a women's branch, right? Girls' women's branch, and it was called Cumann na mBan. But the women in that organization by the sort of the mid 1960s and early 70s, when they were involved with the Provisional IRA, were kind of almost, second-class citizens, because there was a misogynistic character to the IRA. It was run by men, and women were rather mothers, or if they were in our organization, if you were IRA, well, they ran around and hid the weapons for us, or picked up the weapons for us, give us cover, did some surveillance. But they weren't the shooters or bombers. That changed, of course, with people like the Price sisters. It did change.
Yeah, so how I mean, just going back to the mothers then, how did their experience change as the 70s moved into the 80s? Because the Troubles, and I want to ask you about the term the Troubles later as well, but how did the Troubles evolve for mothers? Because during the 70s you sort of have these street battles, don't you? But
Yes.
into the 80s it gets dirtier, as of course you know.
Well, because you have that sort of dirty war. I mean, the war from the early 1970s, there were indications in the early 1970s that there was a war in the shadows. There was a lot of very grisly stuff going on. For instance, to give you an example, the UDA in East Belfast, the Ulster Defence Association, was a Protestant paramilitary group. One of their killing squads was being run by a guy who was a former British soldier who actually was a state asset. And, you know, he was involved in some very, very brutal killings because there was a lot of sectarian killings at that time. You also had, you know, Brigadier Frank Kitson come in around 1970, and he brought with him a kind of colonial experience and a colonial understanding of how you deal with terrorism, which was counterterrorism. But it was counterterrorism in a certain kind of way. It was the kind of counterterrorism that was used in Kenya, or they called it Kenya. You know, when I was in Kenya and not Kenya, you know. So the thing is that he brought to this the idea of setting up squads and using locals within them. In other words, recruiting members of the IRA and building them into units. And at the time was called the Military Reaction or Military Reconnaissance Force. It had both those names. And so you had that happening. But then the intelligence war became much more sophisticated. But the big element within it was the use of terrorist agents, which really lasted right to the 90s. In other words, recruiting people from within all the paramilitaries. And they were your terrorists, really. I mean, if you're running a terrorist and you're a handler, he's your terrorist. Because, you know, you're going to have to let him be a terrorist if he's going to have the kind of bona fides to be able to survive within a terrorist organization. He has to be good at terror. So his bosses like him, and they, you know, he learns everything, and then he passes what he learns on to his handler. But at the same time, you might have to learn to kill people, or to, you know, carry out bombings. Because in the long run, he's going to the sort of the mentality was, or the thesis was that, well, my guy, right, he's going to save more lives in the long run. If he kills a few now, okay, fine, we have to put up with that. This really was part of the reasoning. I mean, you can understand it in many ways, because this is a war, and in a war, nothing's clean on all sides. I mean, you're fighting a very, very difficult enemy, and you're fighting an enemy which is very vicious, you know, and is willing to blow up people if necessary, put bombs in you know, in civilian areas, knowing that the likelihood is that innocent people are going to be killed. So when you're dealing with that kind of enemy, then you know, there's the kind of latitude for how you combat that kind of violence. And I think at a very high level within the British architecture, political and intelligence, there was an understanding that, okay, we have to sort of do things which, you know, we don't really want to do, but do it and keep it under wraps.
At CareFM, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. Some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form, and if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
But I get the sense that during the 70s, you had this, like you've mentioned Kitson, this sort of colonial mindset that we'll just treat Northern Ireland like we'd treat Kenya or Malaya.
Yes, of course.
But I mean, and for example, I still can't understand why you would place such an aggressive regiment as the Parachute Regiment to police a civil rights demonstration, you know, on Bloody Sunday.
I think part of the problem was that when the Troubles broke out in 1969, Jim Callaghan, who was Home Secretary, you know, went into Whitehall and said, well, what have we got in Northern Ireland? And what they found was a dusty file in a cabinet. And that was it. It was a dusty file, very little in it. So there was very little intelligence, because other people have been running Northern Ireland, like the Unionists, with majority rule, gerrymandering the place just to maintain their power. And of course, the attitude of London at the time was, well, the army will sort this out for us. Initially, it was let's send them in to stop the van and stop people being slaughtered. But then it becomes something else, and particularly under Heath. I mean, Edward Heath, I think, compromised the army, and that was something that wasn't really understood and hasn't, I think, been fully understood. I discovered that Heath at a meeting of a group called Gen 42. And let me explain. In 10 Downing Street, there was a room upstairs. It was called Gen 42. Nobody knew what Gen stood for. It stood for general, as in army general, or just general. But it was where all discussions, the serious discussions, were had about Northern Ireland, and led by the PM. Now, one of those meetings, Field Marshal Lord Michael Carver is there, right? And he tells him, right, your guys, right, can shoot protesters in the streets of Northern Ireland because they're enemies of the crown. And Carver said, what? Who gave you that advice? And he said, Hailsham, it's Attorney General. And Carver said, do you think I'm going to put my soldiers through that? I mean, when they're standing high in the dock, are you going to be in the court defending them? He said, I'm not going to do it. So Carver said he wasn't going to do it. Carver also told me that he didn't even know about the special interrogation procedures that were used at the time of internment. Now, Sir Dick White within the cabinet, who was the intelligence chief, he knew, but they hid it from the army. And I think the view of the generals that I spoke to, they were very genuine and honest about it. They felt that the attitude of Heath was that the army can solve the problem for us. And I think that was a very, very dangerous concept, because an army is not built for the kind of conflict that existed in Northern Ireland. It's not built for peacekeeping. But what Heath wanted them to do was to go in and give us a military victory here and a political victory. And the army didn't want to do it, but it was forced to do it. It had no choice. The political masters were dictating that. And I think the army, in many ways, resented Heath. I mean, when I interviewed Heath about this, he ordered me out of his house, right? And the camera crew as well. His beautiful home, in Salisbury. He ordered me out. He actually said to me when he's ordered me out of the house, he said to me, Lord Carver's coming for lunch today with the Japanese ambassador. As soon as I got out, I'm standing outside Heath's house, right? And I phoned Carver and I said to him, hey, Heath just told me you're coming here for lunch. He said, what? He said, you must be joking. I said, well, he might have some nice wines. Carver was a great guy. I mean, wonderful guy. I felt that those men who were in charge of the army at that time were placed in a very difficult position. Now, with Kitson, it was very different. Kitson was a kind of god to most of them. They thought that Kitson was the guy who couldn't do any wrong, in the sense that he knew all the strategies. The strategies had worked in Aden, in Cyprus, Kenya. So he had the kind of freedom which I think was dangerous, because at that time that was really the beginning of the Dirty War. And we don't know how many people were killed by the MRF. We don't, because a lot of it was blamed at the time on the paramilitaries on both sides. But the attitude was, they were going out and they were sort of doing all kinds of stuff. And some was creative, and in some ways, like the Foursquare laundry operation, where you're picking up laundry and then you're taking it back to a base and you're testing it for lead residue to find out if the people who just gave you that laundry are IRA, and they've been sort of firing weapons. But again, that fell apart because the IRA at that time had some very clever people working in their intelligence outfits, and that was people like Brendan Hughes.
It's interesting, you were talking about how the Provisional IRA had changed, I guess, evolved and included women in a more prominent role as we move into the 80s. And certainly Mairead Farrell, well, she's sort of quite strong on her feminism, and she, for the benefit of listeners.
Well, you have Mairead Farrell, but really the people who set the tone for that were really the Price sisters.
Right.
Yeah. There's no doubt about it, because they were
you conclude your book with.
Yeah, they were part of a group called the Unknowns. How unknown they were is another matter of conjecture. But they were part of a group called the Unknowns within the IRA.
Is that an anachronism, that title? Were they actually called the Unknowns at the time?
No, they were
Or did
called the
they-
Unknowns. Yeah, they were somebody gave them that title within the IRA. And so they were brought into the mainstream, right, of the organization, which women hadn't been before. So that really set the pattern. I mean, they're involved, they're involved in all kinds of stuff, right? But then along comes Mairead Farrell. So the process have already demonstrated that, women can sort of play a major role in this war. And Farrell comes in, but she's a girl who comes off the streets, really. I mean, she's on the streets throwing petrol bombs, but she graduates from there, like a lot of young people did, boys and girls, that joined the ranks of the IRA, the youth movement first, and then to be trained in the use of weapons, explosives, whatever. And then they find themselves within the mainstream. And Mairead Farrell was one of those people. I mean, she was very, very bright. And she was she was an Irish dancer. She was top of her class at school. So she ends up in the IRA. And the interesting thing is that the first operation that she's on, right, is to blow up a hotel. And with two other guys, and one of them was her boyfriend, and that was against the rules because the IRA's Green Book was very clear about having relationships within the organization because of the danger of being, compromised. But she goes to bomb this hotel and a pair of sort of like platform shoes, right, dancing shoes, and she's got a 4.5, right, 45, a heavy weapon. It was like Bonnie and Clyde, yeah. And when she gets there, the two guys leave her in the lobby, to hold the staff, right?
And they're all three are very young, aren't they?
Yes, they're all young. They're all sort of they're not even 20. These are 18 year olds, that kind of. And the two young guys, one of them was a really good footballer, and they were. You wouldn't have expected if you'd met them. You'd have thought, well, these are just sort of ordinary kids. But the thing is that everything goes wrong. The two guys plant the bombs in the hotel, and then they discover that the operation was blown, and the police and the army are on their way. So they decide to all run for it, but they can't get back to the van that they came in. So she goes one way and the guys go the other way, but she can't run in her platform shoes, right? Okay, so she has to hide in bushes, and that's where she's found by a cop. Now the thing is that she expected to be shot dead. Maybe if a member of the SAS had found her, he might have done so, but the cop didn't, and that had a big impact on her life much later, on her sense of mortality. But her boyfriend is killed because her boyfriend, the two guys, try to take over a house and don't realize that the house is owned by a policeman, and the policeman has a gun upstairs. So when one of them takes the policeman upstairs to get the keys for his car, policeman takes out a gun and shoots him, and that's her boyfriend is shot and he dies. The other guy dies on hunger strike later. So she ends up really, I mean, from one operation, she ends up in the women's prison in Armagh, but she speaks Irish fluently. She's very, very bright. And before long, she is running the women in that prison. She's the IRA commander of women much older than her. And she runs a dirty protest. She actually runs then a hunger strike where she almost dies at the same time, the big hunger strike with people like Bobby Sands in the maze. But the IRA,
and the women were slightly ignored on the hunger strike.
Yeah, they
weren't
ignored her hunger strike. You see, they ignored her hunger strike as women. They didn't want the media sort of focusing on these women down in Armagh. They're just secondary issue. They wanted the big focus on people like Bobby Sands writing poetry and dying in the maze, and Thatcher letting them die. Thatcher wasn't concerned about the women in Armagh either. She knew where the real problem was. It was in the maze itself. But the IRA just ignored her. And eventually when she gets out, a lot of people sort of said to her, look, Mairead, you've done your bit for the cause. The good thing here is that you should go out now and start dancing, which she did. And she took up courses at Queen's University. But before long, she's also sitting in Sinn Féin headquarters in Belfast, talking to foreign journalists. Because she's attractive, she's articulate, And so Sinn Féin liked that. But she's now well known. There's nothing that's not known about her in terms of army and intelligence, in terms of MI5 special branch. They know her, right? So the next big thing, what she has to do, when she's so well known, to go to Gibraltar to, decided they can put a bomb in the center of Gibraltar, which is kind of, British area of the military, and some of the guys who served Northern Ireland were in Gibraltar. And so they sent her there. And they sent her there with two guys who were well-known IRA activists. One of them, Daniel McCann, who was a shooter who shot policemen. He was also a bomb maker. And so it was really a setup in many ways. It was compromised before it even began. Thatcher knew all about it. I mean, Thatcher knew the whole operation was blown. I mean, they flew out of Dublin into Torremolinos, so they had to go through sort of several big intel centers. First of all, to leave Northern Ireland, to leave Dublin, which is well watched by Irish Special Branch, and then to arrive in Spain. The Spanish were watching for anybody who come in and out, and they're coming from Dublin. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So one of the things in the book is I kind of looked at this, because this is where eventually, Mairead Farrell dies. The SAS kill her and her two companions, and they kill them in the most efficient manner. She then becomes a hero in her death,
And that's what the IRA wanted then?
Yeah, that's what they wanted, and that's what they got. They got three heroes. Right? They got Farrell and her two companions who suddenly become heroes, and a female who's a hero. And who didn't bomb anything, because there was no bomb actually in Gibraltar. It was still in Torremolinos. This was a dry run to find out if they could put the bomb in the center of Gibraltar.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. I had read Farrell had played a role as almost an advisor for the Army Council.
Well, a lot of these, the thing about it is that a lot of these people, for instance, Daniel McCann, who was with her, had been on the Belfast Brigade as a young man, right? So, and that was an indication of just how serious he was and how he was regarded within the IRA. But he was kicked off it. He was kicked off because he opposed the Adams-McGuinness faction. And Farrell would have been of the same mind. Whether they would have actually been involved in advising anybody at that stage, I don't know, certainly in terms of the Army Council. My understanding is that she didn't really want to go to Gibraltar, and neither did McCann. McCann wasn't stupid. I mean, he knew what the risk, this was really high risk, because they were on every intelligence file. I mean, the intelligence community's attitude was, if somebody that they have tagged as very, very senior operative disappears even for 24 hours, all hell breaks loose. They want to know where that person is. And
yeah, you wrote about that in the Dirty War. It's an interesting facet of the intelligence war.
Yeah, so they would say, okay, we need to find that person now, because that person's disappeared for a reason. They're planning something big. So when you have three so well-known people like McCann and particularly Farrell, and they disappear, and they're in Dublin, and they're going, well, you already know anyway, because this is the one thing about it. They knew in advance that the operation was planned, because you had Scavatici, right? He was one of the biggest agents, not the biggest, but he was one of many. I mean, the IRA was very heavily penetrated at that stage. I think there are very few sort of senior figures who hadn't been tagged by the intelligence community. That's my view. They don't like it.
That makes sense. It really does.
Yeah, and so the operation was already blown. So Farrell, whose first operation, by the way, was blown at the hotel when she starts out, and then the big one, the second one, which is Gibraltar, which is even bigger, it's blown before she even gets on a plane. because the IRA was, was riddled with spies, with agents. I mean, their people had been compromised so much. I mean, people talk about Scappaticci as a steak knife. They use this term steak knife, but steak knife was part of an enterprise. There wasn't one steak knife. There are a lot of people like Scappaticci who were agents. And the British military intelligence really with agents very often used numbers. They didn't use names. MI5 used names. I mean, for instance, the IRA commander in the markets, who was also a pedophile, Davison, his code within MI5 was Agent Ascot. He didn't have a number, right? So they talk about Scappaticci being a British military intelligence agent. He wouldn't have been called Steak Knife. Steak Knife was a kind of project involving a lot of agents like Scappaticci. And so, yeah, because this was an enterprise, and it was right across all the intelligence services in different ways who were running their own agents. And at that stage, that was the thing. I think the IRA at that stage really was almost finished. I don't think there was the kind of strength within the IRA to have carried on any kind of war. Right. Because everybody was sort of, not everybody, but a lot of very senior figures like Scappaticci were just giving up the goods all the time.
You've written about, and there are a few chapters in here where basically you kind of have the utmost sympathy and empathy for these women who are basically dealing with, it's like a playground for psychopaths. There's one in particular, a loyalist paramilitary Top Gun.
Yeah, I mean,
this is a just horrific story.
Yeah, this is a 16-year-old whose father is a brigadier in the Ulster Defence Association of West Belfast. And what is astounding about this is a 16-year-old daughter, Tracy, right, is very attractive. And he thinks he's kind of, Ireland's answer to James Galway. He plays the flute. And he's always trying to sort of play Annie's song like James Galway played it. And because Galway also, he reminds people that, like Galway, he's a Protestant from a Protestant area, and he has been in a Protestant flute band, which Jimmy Galway was before he became the lead flautist in the Berlin Phil under Herbert von Karajan. So Tracy's father, she adores him, and he tells her that when she was born, he lifted her into the air like she was the real prize of his 3 daughters. And he's part of what's called C Company, which is a very vicious unit. But according to Tracy, and that seems to have been true, by the time she's sort of 16, he's more interested in sort of welfare, looking after prisoners and, making sure they get the things they need. But he's also associated with some very, very dangerous people. And one of them is this notorious gunman called, Top Gun. Some called him Two Gun, but he was called Top Gun. And that was his nickname, McCaig. And he sees Tracy and he can't take his eyes off her. And her father realizes this guy's attachment or interest, in his daughter, but he can do nothing about it because she falls for Top Gun. And no matter what the father says or her mother, she ends up marrying him. And this is a guy who killed probably 12 to 20 people. And a lot of them innocent people too.
She's trapped in this relationship.
He's trapped in this relationship, but he's beating her. I mean, they have a daughter, he's beating her. And her father can do nothing about it. I mean, her father goes to the commander of his unit, who's called Johnny Mad Dog Adair. You can imagine the name. It doesn't, it doesn't come out of, something which is that, simple and, inoffensive. So he goes to Mad Dog and says, look, Top Gun here, I mean, he's beating my daughter all the time. Can you do something about it? Well, they can't really. I mean, this guy, everybody's scared of him. But what actually happens then eventually, he buys himself a motorbike, crashes it, and ends up in hospital for some time recuperating and becomes addicted to drugs, heavy painkillers. And that's what he eventually dies from. But Tracy's in the middle of all that, and there's nothing she can do. I mean, it's just worried about her father and that maybe he will go and kill her father if she doesn't sort of, just say nothing, just lies, sit in the background. And a lot of women were like that because these guys just thought, well, women are for our use. You're there and you're a mother and you just do what you're told. That was the general attitude. They didn't have the same kind of usage of women in that sense. They didn't deploy women militarily within the Protestant paramilitaries. They did to some extent, but very, not very much. There's so
A lot
many.
more of a sort of misogynistic strain running through that.
Yeah. So I mean, and Tracy, I mean, is a wonderful girl. She eventually, because her father ends up being killed in a feud, loyalist paramilitary feud, with a buddy of his, and she's still waiting for justice for that, because the people who killed her father have never been brought to justice. But she ends up publicly taking on the paramilitaries in her community, because they're dealing in drugs, they're killing kids right across Protestant districts. She does that. She's fearless. I mean, and maybe it's the experience of having to cope with all of that she eventually sort of finds the strength to say, well, if I can deal with that, I can deal with these people who are killing kids. I'm not going to just stand back and let it happen. I'm going to say something. And so she has done. But one of the things that's very interesting about her is that, like a lot of the women I spoke to, they're all demanding answers. I mean, who killed my son? Who killed my husband? And the answers are not available, because you can't unpack this stuff. Because we talked earlier about the dirty war. How do you unpack it?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about this. I mean, there are, as you say, I mean, there are individual inquiries. We've just had the Pat Finucane inquiry announced, or recently. These are taking it piecemeal. Is there a way that we can, because there's so much division still, of course, 25 years after the
if you're going to suggest, and I know, because
a truth and reconciliation.
Yes, yeah, I was waiting. Yeah, and you're right, because that's the traditional response. You have to have truth and reconciliation. It's not going to happen.
No.
If it was going to happen, it should have happened a long time ago. It's now too late. I think also that there's been a scrubbing of a lot of files by people within the intelligence architecture. You have people who pass on. You have people who are not going to sort of break ranks and take a lead and say, listen, I killed 3 or 4 people. It isn't going to happen. And part of the difficulty for the state is that when you've been running agents, you don't know who else was running. In other words, this big enterprise, there were so many elements to it that who in Whitehall is going to say, well, okay, that organization there, right, which was, let's say the MRA, let's say military intelligence, right? What can they give us? What can RUC Special Branch, or was RUC Special Branch, give us? What will MI5 give us from their files? Do you think all these people are going to come out and say, well, tell you what, we're going to turn over all the files? Because they don't know. Some of them are dealing with agents who are being run by more than one organization, right? Now that makes your head spin. And then you've got to justify that some of them actually were involved in bombings. An example, my late friend, Jimmy Nesbitt, was a fantastic detective involved in bringing down the Shankill Butchers, the gang, the greatest sort of mass murders in British criminal history. But he told me that one day he was sitting in his office and this informant came in. And he came in with an RPG-7 rocket launcher. And he said to Jimmy, I've been given this by my unit commander. What am I going to do with it? And Jimmy said, well, take it home. The guy said, well, what do you mean take it home? Well, he said, take it home. I can't take it, And if you give it to me, how are you going to explain that? Right. So the guy said, okay, I take it home, but what if they want me to use it? Jimmy said, well, you have to use it. It's a great example, isn't it? That, I mean, the guy was a very, very useful source who was helping, Jimmy decide who was planting bombs somewhere, about to plant a bomb, maybe in the center of Belfast. So you got to keep that guy online. And okay, maybe he's going to have to do something that, keeps him in place as a very good agent. So Jimmy sent him home with the RPG-7. That is the kind of craziness of the war. So the women, in many ways, a lot of them said to me, look, what we want justice. And what they mean by justice, they want answers. I mean, it's not that they want to see somebody sort of get put away for life, but I want to know who actually was involved in killing my. Like, for instance, there were judges killed in Northern Ireland, and there were Catholic judges. The IRA was involved. People haven't been brought to the justice. Nobody, and you had so many agents, you had so many informants working within these organizations for different elements of the intelligence community. You would think that, well, should have brought some of them right in, right? We should have put some of them away for these crimes. It didn't happen. So people now know, they know that there was a dirty war that went on. They weren't really aware of it at the time because the media wasn't very conscious of it either. I mean, when I wrote the book, The Dirty War, I mean, people didn't know that the IRA was secretly burying people.
That was back in 1990?
1988. I mean, in
Right.
88, so to my cost, I print the fact that the IRA has been burying people it regards as informers within its ranks, and I named some of them, and I also named the IRA commander in the markets as a double agent, and the IRA gave him a big send off. So you can imagine they bury him in their famous plot. And here's Dillon in the Dirty War saying this guy was dirty. You know, he was an agent, British agent. And so I got myself into a lot of trouble over that. But it was an example at the time that people didn't know that all this was going on. They didn't. So now there's a better understanding. And that's why a lot of these women are saying, okay, I want answers. But the state can't really give them the answers they're looking for. And I understand that it's not easy for any government to open all the files and say, here, there you go. Have a look at all that stuff. Because you don't know who's in there. You don't know what's at the bottom of the barrel, really. But I felt sorry because all the women, in many ways, right across Catholics and Protestants, all shared the same desire. There's no bitterness between them as people. Their bitterness was about the fact they've been denied the truth. And that's the one thing that comes through the book in many ways. It's like, Carol Nice, as a young nurse in London, who marries a Coldstream guard.
I wanted to mention this, yeah.
Simon Ware. I mean, she meets him in a pub. They're listening to Yaz on the jukebox, and she sees him and thinks, "Wow, isn't he lovely?" And and he had seen her before because he knew her previous boyfriend who was in the same regiment, and he told her about this, and she said to him, and he said, but he was a roamer. In other words, he had an eye for other women, and he said, "I was just waiting until I had my opportunity." Right, to approach you, right, to ask you out. But they get married, I mean, within a short time. And the day of their wedding, Simon gets word he's being sent to South Armagh. And, it was one of the worst areas. And he's out leading a patrol early morning, he's blown to bits. And so she never sees his corpse. She's left really with no way to grieve. It's absolutely shocking when you think about the position she was left in, and she marries her first husband, and because she still loves Simon, he thinks that's denial, it's denying him, right? That in some way or other, right, she's not the right person, she doesn't care about him at all, that she loves a dead man, right? I mean, there are a lot of probably widows of soldiers went through this same process, but nobody talked about it. She had to deal with this in her own way, and it wasn't just with the first guy that she married. This was something she found in relationships that she wasn't allowed to profess the love that she had for her young husband who died so tragically in Northern Ireland. She was the one who said to me too, which I thought was fascinating. She didn't like the term, and you mentioned it earlier, the troubles.
Running a business comes with a lot of what ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Yeah, but I've spoken to a few women who say the same.
Yeah, and I'm fully understanding of that, because she wanted to put it on his grave that he was killed in a war in Northern Ireland, and they said, no, you can't do that. That's political. What's political about it? That's what it was. I mean, the trouble is, I mean, is term we use because it's convenient. It's a convenient term. I don't like it particularly. But you know, it just is, it covers a whole panoply of things, right? But the war is probably better in the sense that that's it, that defines it. And for those women and women like Carol, she wanted to say, right, he died in the war. I mean, she's on a trip with the other wives, the France day trip, when she's sort of pulled out of a coach, you know, and told, you know, he's dead. I mean, she just married him, right? And I mean, a couple of months later, he's dead. You know, we don't grasp the enormity of it and how this cascades in over the years into sort of feelings of distress, of hurt. You know, it goes on and on. While you know things change politically, these women are still living with, you know, the same kind of horror, and they're having to revisit it. I mean, there are women I wanted to talk to, and I understood why they refused to talk to me. They just said it was too painful. I mean, one woman, I'd almost written a chapter. Her husband was sort of blowing up the driveway of their home. And he was a sort of paramilitary leader. And she said to me, look, you know, I've got PTSD. And if you write this, it's going to hurt me. And I said, okay. And I just tore up the chapter. So, yeah, one of the things that I realized that was very painful. It was difficult. I found writing this book was more difficult than writing a lot of the other books, because of the fact that you had this sort of raw emotion that was still being expressed by a lot of these women. Whether it was someone whose father was killed when she was just 7 years old, you know, and so she never got past 7. She talks about, you know, the world kind of ended. It's when she was 7.5, because she always refers to it as 7.5, right, when her father died. You've got the young policewoman, Tracy Doak, who had a brilliant career ahead of her. I used to have her photograph on my desk here, you know, just to remind me, you know, of what I was writing about. And she had a wonderful opportunity to rise through the ranks, the highest ranks of policing in Northern Ireland. And she's killed with 3 of her colleagues in a car blown to bits on a border road, while they're, you know, being asked to guard a van full of currency from the Republic, from Dublin, going north, Northern Ireland, over the border. And Tracy, her father was a policeman, and so it hurt, you know, it hit him very, very hard too. You know, because she was following really her father's footsteps when she was a little girl. She used to sort of run around with his hat and all on, you know, in the house. As little girls do, they sort of, you know, they're mirroring what their parents are, you know. And I kept looking at her photograph, you know. I kept it on my desk. And you find when you're talking to some of these women, Mary Kane, whose family died in a bombing in a pub called McGurk's in Belfast. I mean, when she's a child, she's going by the bomb site every day to school, and so are her, you know, her little brothers, and they're all behaving really badly. Their mother, for a start, mental health just deteriorates because she thinks that their husband just is not dead because he never came home, because there was no body, right? He was blown up as well, and they didn't release the body for a certain amount of time. And the one thing with these kids was that one of them in school can't spell father because she never had a father. One of the boys is smearing his room with feces. Another one was drawing sort of coffins with, you know, skeletons in them. So that's something that these kids are having to deal with, and the mother just couldn't really cope. And that family ends up with further tragedy later when one of the boys is murdered. So the thing is about this, that, you know, you talk to some of these women and they will take you through this, and the detail is exact. You know, there's kind of exactitude about the detail because they haven't forgotten any of it. Or some of it I might have to say, well, that was when such and such event occurred. You know, I'm the sort of go through my memory of a lot of stuff. They're so exact and so precise, specific, which shows you that they're having to live this throughout their lives. And I think a lot of it's because there's been what people call closure. I know it's a kind of overused word, but closure, I think, in a way means that answers have been provided. I think that's what closure, to me, the closure really means is, yes, at least I have answers now, right? At least I have a better understanding of what happened. They've had no understanding because it hasn't been provided. All they've had to deal with is rumor, speculation, conspiracy theories, and newspaper articles.
And in some cases, walking past the killers of their loved ones.
Well, this is it. One girl talked about her and her mother, and they knew that the guys were walking past, killed her father, and was not brought to justice either. And it was always a suspicion that individual or one of them involved in the murder was a state agent, because you've got to have a reason why. And so sometimes, that suspicion is not entirely correct. There could be other factors, that there wasn't sufficient evidence to bring before a court. But there's been too much of that you have to really sort of say, well, it can't all be, right? Because of the lack of, evidence. I found the book difficult to write.
Well, it's very powerful to read, Martin. Oh, look, we're really out of time, actually, and it's been really fascinating talking to you. So I must thank you. And the book links are in the show notes for listeners. I really do recommend this one. It's the story of the Troubles, but seen through women, which is an unusual title. But thank you, Martin.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Please do give a generous review and share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But in the meantime, thank you and good night.